"She's not broken. She's thirsty." Nobody answered. Nobody was sure who'd spoken. Norman Strand looked up from the schematic spread across the fender of the tool cart, red marker in hand, and found an old man in a charcoal work jacket standing at the tank's forward hull like he'd been there a while, not touching anything. Just listening, eyes closed, head tilted, maybe 10 degrees, jaw loose, shoulders dropped in that specific way that has nothing to do with being tired. His left hand was moving, slow rotation of something small against his palm. Strand looked at the nearest tech, who led him onto the floor. The tech shrugged. Someone else checked their tablet. Nobody had a clean answer. Roscoe Brennan didn't open his eyes, didn't offer a name, didn't explain what he meant by thirsty. He just kept turning the coin. The escort's name was Harker, a young specialist with a lanyard full of badges and the brisk walk of someone who had been told twice already today not to let civilians onto the main floor. He put 2 fingers lightly on Roscoe's elbow, firm enough to mean business, not quite firm enough to be rude. "Sir, visitor areas back along the east wall. There's seating." Roscoe moved with him, not resisting, not hurrying. He walked the way water moves through a pipe. No wasted direction, no friction, just a calm and unhurried transit toward wherever gravity pointed him. Except he stopped at the tank. Not dramatically. He didn't plant his feet or turn to face it. He just ceased forward motion, the way a clock hand pauses at the top of its arc before it drops. His left hand drifted to the hull, palm flat against the fuel access panel just forward of the left spunson, and he held it there, not pressing, not gripping. His fingers were spread at a slight angle, and from across the bay, where Cleveland Moretti was rerouting a sensor cable for the 3rd time that morning, the contact looked almost clinical, like a man checking for a temperature he couldn't read with instruments. His right hand came out of his jacket pocket, a silver dollar, old. Not antique old in the way collectors mean, but worn old, the way something gets when it lives in a hand for decades. The face of it was nearly flat, the relief of the eagle on the back dulled to a ghost of itself. He turned it over, not quickly, a slow rotation against the pad of his thumb, the coin rolling across his knuckles in a deliberate half-arc before he caught it and began again. He closed his eyes, his head tilted, left, just a few degrees. His jaw went slack. His shoulders dropped from wherever tension usually keeps them, and for 5 full seconds he was absolutely motionless, except for the coin. Harker said, "Sir?" Roscoe opened his eyes. He didn't look at Harker. He looked at the panel, then at the coin, and he nodded once to himself. A small private accounting of something, before he slid the coin back into his pocket and walked on toward the east wall without being asked again. Cleveland watched him go. Cleveland Moretti was 29, a guard tech with a 2-year civilian certification in armored systems diagnostics, and he had been the junior man on this project long enough to know that the past 4 days had burned through every tool, every schematic, every credentialed engineer Norman Strand could pull into this bay. He had also spent those 4 days learning, in fine and humiliating detail, exactly what he didn't know. He knew what a man looked like who was stalling. He knew what a man looked like who was lost. He'd been both this week. The man in the charcoal jacket was neither. There was something in the way he'd touched the panel. Not diagnostic. Not exploratory, confirmatory. Like he'd already held a question in his head for some time, and the metal had just answered it. And the coin. Cleveland couldn't say why the coin bothered him, except that it wasn't fidgeting. Fidgeting was nervous. Whatever that rotation was, it was the opposite of nervous. He watched Roscoe lower himself onto the bench along the east wall, draw the coin back out, and hold it loosely in his open palm, just resting there, not turning it now, waiting. Cleveland went back to the sensor cable, pulled the wrong connector, swore under his breath, looked up again. Roscoe hadn't moved, but his eyes were tracking the length of the hull from 60 feet away with a slow, methodical sweep, the kind of deliberate attention that reminded Cleveland, unsettlingly, of the instructors at his certification course who could spot a fault before the software flagged it. Nobody who belonged in a waiting room looked at a machine like that. Roscoe found a parts crate near the south wall and sat down on it without asking anyone's permission. He didn't slump. He didn't pull out a phone. He set his hands on his knees with the easy weight of a man who had learned long ago how to wait without wasting the waiting. His right hand rested flat. His left turned the silver dollar over. Slow rotation, thumb riding the worn edge, not looking at it, just turning. The engineering team ran another cable harness to the diagnostic panel bolted to the tank's left flank. One of the younger technicians jogged past with a laminated checklist. Norman Strand stood at the central workbench with a fresh schematic spread open, his red marker already moving, annotating margins in the shorthand of a man who needed everyone to see him thinking. Roscoe watched the temperature gauge on the secondary instrument cluster across the bay. It was mounted high on the starboard bulkhead, 40 feet from where he sat. Too far for most people to read comfortably. He read it without moving. The ambient temperature in the bay had dropped 2 degrees since he'd come in from outside. He knew this, not because anyone had told him, but because his forearms had told him, and because the gauge confirmed it. He filed that away. One of the technicians called out a crank attempt. The engine turned over, not firing, just cycling. The starter motor grinding with that distinctive hollow labor, like something reaching for a gear it couldn't find. The sound lasted 4 seconds and died. Roscoe exhaled slowly through his nose. He had timed that on his breath, not with a watch, not with a counter, with the expansion of his chest. 4 seconds of labored cranking, then cut off. He timed the next one the same way when it came, 4 seconds. Same rhythm, same hollow reach, same silence. When a machine is lying to you, it lies consistently. That was the thing about machinery nobody taught you in a classroom. The inconsistencies were the truth. The consistencies were the story. He turned the coin over again. There was a man who'd told him that. Taught him to listen for the shape of a failure instead of the cause. Taught him that the cause would announce itself once you stopped arguing with what the instrument said and started listening to what the machine was saying in the space between the readings. The coin had belonged to that man. Pressed into Roscoe's hand in a field hospital with a grip that had been strong right up until it wasn't. He'd had it for 31 years. The face was so worn now you could barely make out the date. 1971, same year they'd both shipped out the first time. He turned it over. The eagle side was smoother. He'd been turning it eagle side up longer. 31 years of listening to machines the way that man had taught him to listen. He looked at the fuel access panel he'd touched on, his way to the waiting area. The metal around the seam was clean. Too clean, relative to the surrounding surface. Not clean deliberately, just undisturbed. Nobody had cracked that panel in the 4 days of diagnostics. He knew this. The way you know a door hasn't been opened, by the absence of marks that handling leaves. He looked at the temperature gauge again. Down another ½ degree. The crank attempt came a third time, 4 seconds. The same hollow labor, the same silence. Roscoe's jaw loosened, his shoulders settled. His eyes closed for just a moment, head canted, slightly left the coin motionless in his palm, and he listened to the absence of ignition, the way a doctor listens to a chest that isn't moving right, cataloging what was missing rather than what was present. When he opened his eyes, Cleveland Moretti was watching him from across the bay again. Roscoe paid him no attention. He already knew what was wrong with the tank. He was just making sure he was right. Norman Strand noticed him on the second pass. He had been walking the length of the tank with a fresh schematic printout, red marker uncapped, annotating something near the rear drive sprocket housing. He turned at the far end, took 3 steps back toward the diagnostic terminal, and stopped. Roscoe was standing at the fuel access panel again. Left hand at his side, coin turning. Right hand resting flat against the hull, not gripping, not pressing, just resting there, reading the cold metal the way a doctor rests 2 fingers against a wrist. Who authorized you back on the floor? Not a question. A statement with a question mark, implied somewhere behind it, the kind of sentence that expects you to understand you've done something wrong before you've had a chance to explain yourself. Roscoe didn't turn around. Nobody. Norman walked toward him with the particular energy of a man who has been awake for 4 days and is now encountering one more problem he did not schedule. He was mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, the kind of competent that looks good in front of a whiteboard. The red marker was still uncapped in his right hand. Sir, this is a controlled maintenance environment. That tank is government property in active remediation. I have a 6-person engineering team, $60,000 in replaced components, and a report due to the contracting office by end of week. I don't know who you are or how you got past the watch desk a second time, but you cannot be here without authorization, and you cannot be touching that vehicle. Roscoe took his hand off the hull. He turned around slowly, no urgency in it, and looked at Norman Strand the way a man studies a weather report. He already knew was wrong before he opened it. Ambient temperature dropped 6 degrees since you started this morning, he said. That matters. Norman blinked. Just once, then the professional surface closed back over it. With respect, I don't know what you think that means in context of a fuel system diagnostic, but thermal variance in this range doesn't affect the fault profile we're tracking. We're dealing with a pressure side irregularity in the injection sequence. Temperature is not a variable. It is with this engine. Sir Norman's voice dropped a register. Quieter and more precise. The voice you use when you want someone to understand they are finished speaking. I have a mechanical engineering degree from a program that takes 12 people a year. I spent 8 years at the contracting firm before this posting. I have worked on variants of this platform for the better part of a decade. I understand what you're trying to contribute, and I want to be respectful about this. But what you're describing is folklore. Temperature as a diagnostic indicator for a fuel side fault on this system is not in any manual, any technical bulletin, or any service documentation I have ever reviewed. Roscoe looked at him for a moment. The coin turned once in his palm. I know, he said. That landed somewhere Norman hadn't expected it to, and a half-second of something moved across his face before he recovered. I'm going to need authorization documentation before you take another step toward that vehicle. He recapped the marker. If you have credentials relevant to this project, get them to the duty officer. Otherwise, I have to ask you to return to the visitor area. Roscoe nodded, one small dip of his chin. He turned and made his way to the parts crate at the bay's edge. No argument, no raised voice. No, look back at the tank. Cleveland Moretti had been watching the whole exchange from 20 feet away, a torque wrench loose in his hand, and when Roscoe passed him, Cleveland said nothing. But his eyes tracked the old man all the way to the crate. Roscoe sat down. The coin began turning again. He wasn't done. He was just waiting for the temperature to finish its work. Norman Strand had been patient enough. That was how he said it to the depot sergeant, that he had been patient enough. He crossed the bay with his schematics rolled under one arm and a red marker uncapped in his hand, and he didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. His voice carried just fine at its normal register. That was a kind of authority he had worked on. I need this individual escorted off the maintenance floor and returned to the visitor area, he said, not to Roscoe, but to the sergeant, standing 4 feet away from Roscoe. Permanently this time. We have a second diagnostic cycle starting in 20 minutes and I won't have the liability. The sergeant glanced at Roscoe. Roscoe was turning the coin. Sir, the sergeant started. The floor is classified access, Norman said. That's not a judgment call. Roscoe let the coin settle flat in his palm. He looked at Norman the way a mechanic eyes, a reading he doesn't trust, not hostile, just checking. It's not your fuel lines, Roscoe said. Norman turned to face him fully, a small, controlled breath through the nose. The kind of breath a man takes before explaining something obvious to someone who has made the same mistake twice. We have replaced the primary filter housing, both secondary filters, the entire injector feed assembly, and 42 meters of pressurized line, Norman said. We have run 4 complete diagnostic cycles on this engine. The fault codes point to fuel starvation at the injector rail, which means the fuel delivery system, which means we are looking in exactly the right place. You're looking at the lines, Roscoe said. The fault is inside the tank itself. Standpipe. A beat. Norman's expression didn't change, but something around the eyes did. A slight compression, the way a man's face moves when he hears something he has already dismissed and doesn't want to revisit. The standpipe in that tank is a welded internal component, Norman said. It doesn't fail. It has no failure mode under standard operating parameters. Collapses, Roscoe said. Inward, on the seam. Takes about 4 days of low idle and cold ambient temperatures. You won't see it on a diagnostic because the sensors read tank pressure, not standpipe integrity. The fuel pool's at the bottom, the pickup can't reach it. The bay was loud. Compressors, a radio somewhere, the tick of cooling metal. But the three men in that immediate space had gone quiet. Norman looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a short, professional laugh, the kind that does not signal amusement so much as the gentle closure of a conversation that has run past its useful length. "That's not a documented failure mode," Norman said. "If that were a real pattern, it would be in the technical manual." Roscoe said nothing. "I appreciate the input," Norman added, which was the politest version of what he meant, and turned back to the sergeant. "Please see him out. 200 miles away, or thereabouts, in the depot commander's office." Attached to this same armory complex, a flag had come back on a routine visitor badge verification. Archive pulls usually took days. This one had been flagged for expedited handling because the service record it corresponded to carried a classification tier that triggered an automatic notification. The depot commander, a man who had seen plenty of service records in his career, read the first page. Then he read it again. He picked up his phone. In the bay, the sergeant had taken a polite half-step toward Roscoe. Roscoe rose from the parts crate without hurry, knees then straightening, the way a large man manages joints that have logged a long mileage. He tucked the coin into his left hand. He moved one deliberate pace toward the door. Then he stopped, not because anyone told him to, because the tank, under the last cooling tick of a failed crank attempt, made a sound that only he heard. Norman Strand had an audience, and he knew how to use one. He'd pulled 3 of the junior engineers into a half-circle near the tank's front glasses. Schematics fanned out against the hull, and he was going. Credential by credential, clause by clause. The full weight of 4 days of professional authority bearing down on the single suggestion that the fault lived inside the primary tank rather than the fuel delivery system. "The standpipe is a fixed structure," he said, red marker tracing a line on the printed schematic without touching it. "It does not collapse. It is not subject to thermal deformation at the ambient ranges we're talking about. This is not a conjecture problem. It is a diagnostic problem. And the diagnostics have been run by people who, which one of you is Brennan?" The voice came from the far end of the bay, not loud, not urgent. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard in places far louder than this. It carried the way authority carries, without effort, without announcement. The depot commander walked across the drain-grated floor, with a printed page. In one hand, badge lanyard still swinging from where he'd fast walked in from the admin wing. He was scanning faces. He found Roscoe standing at the tank's left flank, one palm flat, against the fuel access panel, coin loose in his other hand. "That you?" "Yes, sir," Roscoe said. The commander looked down at the page, then back up. Something shifted in his expression, not theatrical, just the quiet recalibration of a man who has just learned he misread a room entirely. "Says here your visitor badge triggered an archive flag standard protocol." He paused. "Record came back about 20 minutes ago." Norman had gone quiet, not willingly. The sentence had just run out of air somewhere behind him and hadn't restarted. The commander read from the page without looking up. "Master Sergeant Roscoe Brennan, 26 years, combat vehicle systems, collateral duty, combat medic." He glanced up. "Deployed across." He listed the designations, each one a notation in the record, nothing more. Then he got to the line that changed the temperature of the room. "Field repair addendum, armor system, technical manual, original author." He lowered the page. "Call sign, Iron Hand." The name landed flat and clean in the open bay, the way a tool lands on a metal surface. Across the floor, Cleveland Moretti had been threading a fuel line coupling. His hands went to the deck. He straightened up, slowly, turned, and looked at Roscoe with the particular attention of a man trying to reconcile a face with something he has known only as a name on a page. Then he came to attention, not snapping, not performing, just the quiet vertical alignment of a man who understands what the moment requires. Roscoe did not look at him. His eyes were on the tank. The coin turned once in his left palm. Norman Strand still had not spoken. He was holding his red marker. He had not recapped it, but he wasn't moving it either. His schematic was still open against the hull. The line he had drawn still wet. The commander folded the page once. "The sergeant tells me you've been standing by this vehicle for the better part of 4 hours." "Yes, sir." "You have a diagnosis?" "I have a fix," Roscoe said. "Diagnosis is already done." He said it without weight, without theater. The same way you'd say the weather. Norman opened his mouth. Something was forming. A procedural objection, a credential, another clause in the argument he'd been building. It didn't arrive. He looked at the name on the printed page, still in the commander's hand. The schematic against the hull was still showing the fuel delivery system, not the tank. Roscoe had already turned back toward the fuel access panel. His hand found the edge of it the way a hand finds a door it has opened 1,000 times before. "Brennan." The depot commander's voice cut across the bay without effort, not loud. Just the kind of voice that had been used in large spaces for a long time. Roscoe turned. His hand left the fuel panel without hurry. The commander was mid-floor, threading between diagnostic carts and coiled cable runs. A printed sheet in his left hand, not a reprimand. Something else. He was reading as he walked, which meant he was still processing what he was reading. Norman Strand had stopped talking, not because anyone interrupted him. He had simply run out of room, the way a sentence stops when the air leaves it. And now he was watching the commander across the bay with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. The commander reached Roscoe and looked at him directly, looked at the worn jacket, the frayed cuffs, the folded rag in the breast pocket. Then he looked at the sheet. "Your visitor badge flagged. An archive pull." He didn't say it as an accusation. Standard clearance verification on older records. "They just got back to me." He turned the sheet so Roscoe could see it, though it was clear he didn't need to. "Master Sergeant Roscoe Brennan." The commander read it with the weight of a man reading something he did not expect to be reading today. 26 years Combat Vehicle Systems Collateral Medic Certification. Multiple overseas deployments. A pause. "Call sign." He read it aloud. "Iron Hand." It landed in the open bay the way a single note lands in a quiet room. Across the floor, Cleveland Moretti had been reaching for a torque wrench on the side cart. His hand stopped. Not slowly. It just stopped. The way a mechanism stops when the power cuts. He turned his head toward Roscoe. His eyes moved from the worn jacket to the man inside it, and something recalibrated behind them. He let go of the torque wrench, straightened his back, brought his hands down to his sides. He came to attention. Nobody told him to. Nobody nearby would have understood why. But Cleveland Moretti had gone through Armor Tech School on a field manual that had an addendum at the back. 12 pages, unmarked, no author listed, no official source cited, that every instructor taught from and nobody could trace. It covered failure modes that didn't exist in the primary documentation. Fuel starvation patterns under cold soak conditions, cascading ignition faults triggered by ambient temperature drop, the kind of knowledge that only comes from watching machines die in places where you cannot call for parts. Every armor tech who'd been through that school knew the addendum. Nobody knew the name behind it. Until now. The commander looked across at Cleveland, took in the attention stance, looked back at Roscoe with a slightly different expression. "You want to tell me," the commander said, and his voice had dropped to something closer to private, "what exactly you're doing standing next to my tank in a work jacket?" Roscoe turned the silver dollar over once in his left palm. A slow rotation. The face nearly smooth. "Figured she needed looking at," he said. The commander absorbed that. Then he looked at the fuel access panel behind Roscoe, at the length of copper tubing Roscoe had set down on the deck edge, at the faint smell, sharper now, of raw fuel that had not been there an hour ago. Norman Strand took a step forward. His red marker was in his hand. He had not uncapped it. "Commander," he started. "Give him the floor, Norman. Not harsh. Just final." The commander folded the archive sheet once, deliberately, and tucked it under his arm. Then he looked at Roscoe with the particular attention of a man who has just understood that the last 4 days could have been 4 hours. "Walk me through it," he said. Roscoe didn't say anything to the commander right away. He just nodded once, slow, and turned back to the tank. He pulled the worn silver dollar from his palm and tucked it into his breast pocket. Next to the folded rag, when the coin went away, something else came out, a different kind of focus, quieter and more complete. He shrugged the charcoal jacket off one shoulder, freed his right arm, and handed the jacket to nobody in particular. Cleveland Moretti stepped forward and took it without being asked. Roscoe went up the hall in 2 movements. not the careful climb of a man his age navigating unfamiliar steel. The automatic, load-bearing efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times in the dark. His boots found the footholds without looking. His hands found the grab points the same way. Norman Strand watched from 6 feet back. Red marker uncapped, the cap held loose between 2 fingers. Roscoe dropped into the driver's compartment. Someone handed him a work light from the tool bench, and he took it, angled it into the primary fuel access housing, and went to work with a length of copper tubing he'd pulled from his jacket pocket before he handed the jacket off. 1/4 inch. Bent at one end, about 8 inches long. The engineers had been looking at it on the crate beside him all morning, and none of them had asked what it was for. He worked without narrating. No explanation, no performance. His right hand moved in short, deliberate arcs inside the housing, not searching, not exploring, moving directly to something he already knew was there. Cleveland stood at the hull's edge, watching the hands. 40 seconds in, Roscoe stopped. He angled the work light differently. Then he used the pocket knife, a plain, wood-handled folder, nothing tactical about it, to work something loose from inside the housing. It took about 30 seconds of careful, specific pressure at a single point. He came up with a section of internal standpipe, about 4 inches of it, collapsed along one side like a drinking straw that had been pinched and left that way. He held it up briefly under the work light, then set it on the hull deck where everyone in the bay could see it. Norman Strand looked at it. His jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just processing. Roscoe cleared the housing, seated the copper tube as a bypass, and closed the access panel. He didn't rush. He didn't slow down for effect. He worked at exactly the speed the job required. Then he put both hands on the starter. The engine caught on the second crank. Not a sputter, not a hesitation, a deep, uneven cough on the first half rotation, and then a full rolling roar that climbed in pitch and settled into a low, even thunder that moved through the drain grating and up through every person's feet in that bay. Every head turned. The fluorescent light seemed to dim slightly against it, the way strong sound does to everything else in a room. Roscoe let it run for 15 seconds, listening. Eyes closed, head canted just slightly, jaw loose, shoulders dropped, the same way he'd listened to it 4 days ago without touching anything, reading what no instrument had been able to read. Then he opened his eyes, nodded once at nothing in particular, and climbed out. Norman Strand had not moved. The red marker was still uncapped in his right hand, the cap still loose between 2 fingers. He looked at the collapsed standpipe sitting on the hull deck. Then he looked at Roscoe. He pressed the cap back onto the marker slowly, without looking at it. The depot commander said nothing. He didn't need to. Roscoe took his jacket back from Cleveland, fed his right arm back through the sleeve, and reached into his breast pocket. The silver dollar came out again, settling into his left palm. The engine ran on. Cleveland waited until the others had drifted back toward the schematic tables. Then he crossed the bay floor slowly, the way a man approaches something he doesn't want to disturb. "How did you know?" he asked. Not challenging, just honest. Roscoe looked at the coin in his palm, turned it once. "Because I couldn't fix the man," he said. "Figured I'd better get good at fixing the machine." Cleveland didn't say anything. He understood enough to wait. The engine idled on behind them, low and even. A sound like something breathing after a long time underground. Roscoe kept his eyes on the coin. His crew chief's name was Darnell. That was the only name he offered, and he said it the way you say a name that has been worn smooth from private use. They had served together across 3 overseas rotations, 2 of them in places where the vehicles broke down faster than the supply chain could reach them. Darnell had been the one who first taught Roscoe that a machine will tell you what's wrong if you stop talking long enough to listen. That a fuel system under cold stress makes a particular kind of intermittent pressure drop you can feel through the hull plating if your hand is flat and your breathing is slow. Darnell had known things about engines that weren't in any manual, and he'd been generous with every bit of it. The last rotation, the vehicle took a hit that wasn't catastrophic, but was enough. Roscoe had been outside the hull when it happened, 20 feet away. He got to Darnell fast. He knew trauma care. He had trained for exactly that moment, had run through the scenarios hundreds of times. had been collaterally qualified as a combat medic for 9 years by then. It didn't matter. There are injuries that training reaches, and injuries that training doesn't. And that night in the dark, outside a broken vehicle, in a place he still doesn't name out loud, Roscoe discovered the distance between the two. He did everything correctly, every step in the right order. Darnell looked at him the whole time, calm the way people sometimes go calm, and when it was over, he pressed the silver dollar into Roscoe's hand without a word. Roscoe turned the coin over once more. "They gave me a commendation," he said, "for the medical response." A pause. "I put it in a drawer." Cleveland was watching the coin. "The standpipe fault," Roscoe said. "The collapsed one. We had that happen twice in the field. Ambient temperature drops, extended idle, the internal geometry fails, and you get cascading starvation that looks like a fuel line fault, a pump fault, a sensor fault, anything but what it is. I devised a field correction the second time it happened. Copper tubing, a pocket knife, 40 minutes. He glanced back at the tank. 40 minutes that night, 3 minutes today. I've had some practice. Why didn't you ever submit it? Cleveland asked. The fix. The failure mode. It would have been in the manual. Roscoe looked at him, not unkind, not evasive, just direct. I tried, he said. Forms got lost, personnel rotated, I retired. And by then, he turned the coin over one last time, then closed his fingers around it, slow and deliberate. By then, it didn't feel like the kind of thing that belonged in a manual. It felt like the kind of thing you carry. The engine ran on. Across the bay, Norman Strand had recapped his red marker and set it down on the schematic table. He wasn't looking at his schematics. He was looking at the tank, then at Roscoe, then back at the tank, the way a man reassembles a thing he thought he understood. Cleveland didn't come to attention again. He didn't need to. He just stood there beside Roscoe in the fluorescent light and the diesel warmth, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And that was exactly right. Roscoe had wiped his hands on the folded rag, tucked it back into his breast pocket, and declined the depot commander's offer before the man finished making it. No documentation, no formal credit. He shook his head once, unhurried, the way you decline something you genuinely don't want, and then he walked toward the bay doors. The same way he'd walked in, along the wall, out of traffic, without announcement. Cleveland watched him go. The bay doors swallowed him, and the cold air came through for a moment, and then the hydraulic seal closed, and he was gone. The depot clerk had printed the archived copy of the addendum, without being asked. A bureaucratic reflex, something to file. Cleveland held it now. The main text was typed, dense, and technical. But there, in the margin, in handwriting that had the compressed precision of someone who wrote in the dark and under pressure, were 3 lines Roscoe had added by hand. Decades ago. A correction nobody had questioned, because nobody had needed to. Cleveland read it once. Then again. He folded it along its crease, carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to more than one person, and slid it into his breast pocket. The tank idled on.